Hello, and welcome to IRI Growth Insights, featuring IRI thought leaders, industry partners, and guests. For more than 40 years, IRI has been known for its invaluable data, but these podcasts delve into the insights the data reveal to fuel market disruption and market growth for those in the CPG, retail, healthcare, and media markets. I'm your host, Joan Driggs, coming to you from IRI's corporate headquarters in Chicago. Hello, and welcome to another episode of IRI Growth Insights. I'm happy to welcome back Kurian Thomas, COO of Retail here at IRI, and I'm also pleased to introduce John Holtzapfel, Retail Executive and leader of the IRI team serving one of our major retail partners. Today, we're talking about metrics that matter in retail, specifically how retailers and CPGs can measure performance as we lap the COVID-19-induced demand spike and that surge in home consumption that really started about a year ago in March 2020. As kind of a jumping off point for today's discussion, I want to provide a little bit of a recap of 2020. I know we all lived through the nightmare, but I just want to remind you that we went from a 2 to 3% demand growth in CPG retail to this explosion of 56% growth in mid-March of 2020. The panic grab in retail came as a result of the World Health Organization announcement of a coronavirus-related outbreak in Wuhan, China in early January, followed by the CDC confirming the first U.S. case January 21st. By March 11th, WHO had declared the COVID-19 pandemic. Panic shopping ensued. It's been almost a year, but we all remember people hoarding toilet paper, the bare shelves, retailers setting limits on purchases when there was stock available. About the only upside during this period was the huge growth trajectory of e-commerce, which had been growing at a really healthy rate of 22% through 2019. But with the onset of the pandemic, growth in e-com sales was above 80%. Incredible. So this is a lot of fast change. And we anticipate that as we make progress with the vaccine and regain our social mobility, the CPG retail industry won't be seeing the same levels of growth in 2021. We can see why the return to a competitive atmosphere will have retailers wanting to track their share. But why would it change? And Kurian, I'm going to start with you. What specifically are the metrics that matter in 2021? Why are we talking about this today?
It's interesting. At the start of the year, I started to get some interest from a few clients. As an example, a smaller retail client on the East Coast that was getting our market share service delivered monthly. So they would get an update every month on their performance versus the competitive market. And the president and CEO in a meeting asked for a weekly read. And I asked him why, and he said, well, we're going to be lapping COVID, and we know our growth rate's going to be negative, so how do I know how well I'm doing and performing? Because everyone's going to have a negative growth rate in those weeks last year where we were up 50, 60%. And then another client, much larger client, who's already getting a weekly market read, started to ask me whether I could deliver that weekly market read earlier, 3 to 4 days from the end of the week versus 6 to 8. And so I said, well, let me check with my colleagues where this is going on. And we got on a team call, and surprise, surprise, John's client's asking the same question. Other clients are asking the same question. And that's when, this hit me. Wow. The metrics that matter this year could be quite different than the metrics that mattered in the past.
No, I think a lot of, what really got Kurian and I engaged in this conversation was the team meeting that he had where he raised the example he had talked about. And he asked if any other clients are facing, the same challenges. I think the irony of this is that market share has been around forever, right? Clients have always used market share as a measure to understand their performance versus the market. But inside a client's four walls, it was a sleepy, almost boring metric. Right? Maybe they used it on a monthly basis to understand their performance, primarily on a quarterly basis. But as Kurian talked about, as the market started to lap the panic buy of 2020, the only true metric of performance when everyone is essentially going to be facing the same headwinds is around market share. My client, kind of was providing the same questions that were being asked to Kurian. I mean, we went from receiving a question or two on market share on a monthly basis to getting 15, 20 questions on market share every single day. It's completely changed the dynamic and our ways of working with our clients. And as a result of that, it's one of those areas that we've completely refocused on and have created a whole separate initiative in working with our client to help them understand how to interpret these results on a weekly basis. Okay.
So there's growing interest in market share where they're really, it had been sporadic before. And that's like one new big key performance indicator. But let's let's talk about some of the more traditional metrics of performance, used by retailers and CPGs up until now. What does that look like?
Yeah, I would say traditionally one of the dominant metrics used by retailers in particular was comparable store sales growth or same store sales growth. So for a base of stores that were in existence and operated for that full prior year, what was the growth in sales, right? And that was a metric of growth. And many retailers have talked about year over year, quarter over quarter, comp store sales growth as the metric. And they benchmark that versus the competition. But that was often the dominant, as John said, market share existed in retail, used in some areas and, by some folks, but it was a little bit more of a sleepy measure. Now, CPGs, on the other hand, have thought about market share more, much more, because at even the same retailer, they're competing for shelf space and consumers with other brands. And so, how much share of that retailer's sales did I capture? Share of wallet, things like that. Now, what makes us so those were the traditional metrics. Now, beyond COVID, what's also accelerating is this omnichannel phenomenon, right? So now, traditionally as a consumer, it'll take 20, 30, 40 years back, I typically drove to my store and I had a store that was close to me. I liked the assortment there, and that's where I went for the most part, right? It's a little harder for me to drive, don't frequently drive as much to another store. But now you can click online and place an order and have any product from any brand anywhere in the country, maybe anywhere in the world, delivered to your doorstep in 48 hours. Now the benchmark of growth is very, very different, right? That's, we think, another real impetus for looking at other metrics versus the traditional.
I would agree with a lot of the comments that Kurian made. I think that, when you think about traditional retail metrics, they were primarily around what's happening inside their four walls. The idea of like ID store sales growth, for example, cost of goods, product profit margin, supply chain inventory, and for some of the more advanced retailers, the customer loyalty data, households, trips, baskets. Once again, what's happening inside my four walls? As Kurian talked about, or as Kurian and I both talked about, the pandemic changed that, right? Because it became more important to understand performance, in a post like panic buy time period. And then the introduction, the explosion of omnichannel was a whole nother element that created a challenge. I mean, when everyone is growing at unprecedented rates, and then you have a new channel emerging, how do you truly start to think about what success looks like and how you're performing and how you start to work and collaborate with CPGs, right? I think it's the kind of the combination of all of these factors is what is the reason now that market share is gaining a more important or a seat at the table with some of those traditional metrics.
Okay, but market share, again, been around forever, but there's a couple different sides to it. You can talk about the benefits, you can talk about the watch outs. Are people as aware of that in this omni-channel world? Help us understand what that looks like.
Well, so I think you got to start with like the core benefit of market share and kind of what this is, right? And we talked about this up front. I probably already said it, right? But it helps a retailer understand their performance versus a competitive market, primarily within their view of the world from a product and from a geography perspective. But if you're only looking at your sales from inside your own four walls, you could be missing opportunities for growth that you never knew existed. So, for example, a lot of retailers will take a look at internal sales data and they'll see, a category, bagged snacks, for example, right? They're increasing sales year over year. And so, they have a reason to celebrate that's performance is strong. Typically, or I should say like historically, a lot of retailers would kind of take that and they push that to the side and go look for another category to focus on. The reality is by putting that next to the performance in the market, you can start to understand or identify opportunities for growth based on where a category that is showing strong growth is actually underperforming versus the market, or a category that's actually growing sales is losing market share. In retail with my client, we call it the blind spot. These are categories that retailers never even knew where opportunities existed. I will tell you some of the largest opportunities that we have unsurfaced from my retail client have been around these blind spot categories that they had watched grow for month over month over month without ever understanding that they were actually losing share in the market because the retailers were doing something different around price, promotion, assortment, or distribution. So what are the watchouts? First off, market share is a pretty simple metric because by definition, it is simply a numerator, which is the retailer sales, and the denominator, which is the marketplace. And as one of those changes, market share increases or it decreases. And historically, retailers had monitored market share on a rolling, we'll say monthly, quarterly, or annually basis, which provided very stable and trendable results. But as we had talked about early, more and more retailers are starting to think about market share on a weekly basis, which aligns more closely with how they think about managing their business. 1 week market share introduces more volatility to this really simple metric compared to the longer time periods, primarily due to the idea that on a 1 week basis, you have to start trending holidays and promotional periods that may not line up versus a year ago. Look, the easiest example, right, is Tom Brady's, triumphant 7th Super Bowl. The Super Bowl in 2020 finished on February 2nd, or was played on February 2nd. This year's Super Bowl was played on February 7th. Year over year, not a trendable week. And so if a retailer, for example, puts a lot of emphasis on that Super Bowl week, they could be comparing this week's sales or last year's sales versus a week that does not correspond and see very misleading results. And as a result of that, what can happen a lot of times is just by simply not being educated on these nuances. You can put a lot of resources on an organization to tackle a problem that's not even driven by business factors. It's just a misalignment in the calendar.
So you actually want to track the trend rather than like the snapshot. Okay. So what trends are you seeing with some of those more data-driven retailers and how they're using market data to not only explain, some of those market share changes, but more importantly, I think to identify those opportunities to grow market share?
Well, I think one of the big things that we see with what I would say is a lot of the best in class retailers around market data is they don't necessarily just use market data to understand or to size their performance or to measure their share. They're actually going a layer below that and identifying what are the factors that are providing opportunities for growth or barriers to growth. And typically you start thinking about price, you start thinking about promotion, and then you start thinking about distribution or assortment, opportunities specifically. I think, the most data-driven organizations have the ability to not just necessarily understand these different drivers, but they're creating business practices around these. They're actually standardizing templates and business rules that will allow for their organization to start decomposing changes in market share by price, promotion, assortment at scale. And so they're able to very quickly, on a weekly or a monthly basis, identify these opportunities. Now, what I would say is even within the best in class, we're seeing the most innovative retailers actually start to take these business rules and embed them into their technology so that they can automate the actual insight process. and going from an actual person, kind of flipping through a PowerPoint or an Excel sheet to actually having a machine identify what the insight is, prioritize or quantify that opportunity, and then prioritize that. So this week, they know very specifically market share was down X points, and these 5 UPCs provide the greatest opportunity to help reverse that trend due to changes in price, promotion, or assortment based on what's happening versus rest of the market.
Right. Well, and I would say truly like augmented decision making, that can be its own podcast. It's super fascinating. But I want to bring it back to this. I'm going to bring it back to this, market metrics and stuff. And we talked earlier about the growth that e-commerce experienced during the pandemic. And it's pretty likely that that's going to soften, a little bit, just like everything else, but it's still going to continue with strong growth. And I also think that there's going to be a lot of differences among other channels and what market share measurement looks like between channels. So, Kurian, how can brick and mortar retailers compete in this new world? Like, what metrics matter moving forward?
Yeah. So similar to our discussion on market share, which in a traditional sense has been in the brick and mortar channel, we now are helping a lot of our clients, both retailers and CPGs, understand their performance via market share and other metrics in an omni-channel world or in the e-commerce world. So e-commerce being just the online sales, and omni-channel as we define it being e-commerce, in-store, other channels that may not be tracked today. And even as we're thinking about it, expanding potentially into consumption in the restaurant space. So you have a view of total share of stomach, right? And so this is a newer area. Market share in omni-channel is a newer area. So the measurement metrics are not as robust. But IRI does have a service called the eMarket Insight Service that helps us measure, through which we measure e-commerce sales, and we combine it with our brick and mortar and other channels for a total measurement of omni-channel sales and share. And it is the best-in-class service in the industry. Most of our retailers and our CPG clients subscribe to that. And John actually pioneered this service for us. So I'm gonna have him maybe explain a little bit. It is pretty compelling.
Yeah, I'll tell you, this is probably one of the areas that I am most passionate about in this space. And several years ago, my retail client came to me and they said, and their general hypothesis was that IRI was doing a great job of helping them understand their performance and the current definition of the market based on how we were collecting data. But they wanted to understand, what about all that white space that existed out there that wasn't part of this universe? And so as part of this process, and really that white space actually, there's two big ideas in that white space, and specifically around e-com, that weren't being addressed. The first was, we're growing at 60, 70, 80, 90%. But the reality is the marketplace may be growing 150, 200%. So how do we identify those opportunities out there in these new channels that we're not necessarily aware of? And then the second piece is, especially around e-commerce, is that as we continue to build our e-commerce practice, are we incrementally growing our business in both brick and mortar and in these e-commerce by fulfillment types, or are we just shifting our sales from one channel or one fulfillment type into a higher cost to serve? And as Kurian talked about just a moment ago, we partnered with our retail client to create a capability that took our traditional multi-outlet or a POS channel and combine that with our eMarket Insights, our e-commerce channel, and really some other non-cooperating retailers or non-cooperating channels to create an expanded definition of the market that would give our retailer a true understanding of their performance versus the entire marketplace. And by doing that, it helped us address both of the questions that we had talked about up front. As e-commerce was growing, they had an ability to understand how their e-commerce growth compared to the marketplace, and where they were underperforming despite, remarkably high growth rates. And then second, it helped them understand their performance by different fulfillment types. And so while their total business may be growing, it allowed for them to go a, one level deeper within their geography portfolios and understand how their market share was performing in traditional brick and mortar and how they were performing in the new e-commerce and those emerging fulfillment channels. We have the ability, because we built this inside their technology platform that we partnered with them on. We have the ability to help them understand this in their view of the product universe and in their view of the geography universe, which is very compelling. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and this is what Kurian talked about, and it's around restaurant data, in quick serve, limited serve, full serve restaurants. And this has always been of interest to retailers, but it's never really been integrated at any type of scale into how they think about managing and monitoring their business. The pandemic changed that. As shelter in place started to become, implemented or executed across the country, mobility decreased, restaurants closed, and retailers benefited from that demand. But as shelter in place restrictions started to get lifted, mobility increases, restaurants start to open, there's real concern among retailers, the impact that that's going to have on their business. And so some of the more innovative retailers, I believe, are trying to find or are finding ways to integrate omnichannel or on-premise data into their omnichannel measurement universe to gain a true understanding of share of stomach. Just another way that they're understanding their performance versus an expanded definition of the market.
And I love that. I love the expanded definition of the market. I like that it includes like the product universe, the geography universe, that share of stomach. But what about the missing element? What about that shopper element? There are a lot of new buyers, a lot of new households out there. How does that factor in here?
Just building on, just one quick comment, building on John's point. I think the important to think about is as retailers expand, as modes of consumption either expand or opportunities for retailers to capture additional modes of consumption expand. I think the importance of, as John was describing, from in-store to adding online to now restaurant, right? I think it is really important for retailers, and the more innovative ones are thinking about how to understand the total size of fries and how they are performing versus being, as the traditional lens has been, what's happening in my four brick and mortar walls, right? But to your point about the shopper and the consumer, ultimately people buy products, right? It's great to have metrics on sales and share, but unless you really think about and manage and monitor and influence those shoppers that walk into your store or click online to purchase, right, or any combination thereof, you're actually not growing the business in a sustainable way, right? So, and a lot of this is newer territory, right? I think the airline industry, the banking industry, the hospitality industry have done a great job of managing loyalty and managing, their consumer base that way. Lots of retailers have loyalty programs. Not many of them use it in a systematic way to manage loyalty and thus their the experience of their shoppers and the brand and the retention of their shoppers, right? And what we would say is, the place to start is some very simple metrics, right? How many shoppers are walking to my store? Who are my most loyal by just how much they spend with me? Am I keeping them? Am I growing my share of their wallet or their spend, right? And that would be, that in and of itself would be sufficient to get started. And John, any other comments?
No, I would agree with you, Kurian. I think that market share kind of measures, or market share measures the performance, it's the results, but how do you drive those results? It's the customers that walk into your store, and having data that helps you understand households, trips, basket size, I think has always been important, right? We talked about that during some of those traditional metrics of those, measuring what happens inside your four walls. And I think they're going to continue to be important going forward. I think the other thing too is utilizing science and analytics really to become very precise on how you segment those shoppers, to understand who your most important shoppers are, how they are behaving inside your store, how you can utilize different types of media tactics to target them, to build that loyalty. And then, as you talked about, Kurian, I think understanding how they behave outside of your store. So things like share of wallet and leakage. Once again, really traditional metrics, but having the ability to measure that and monitor that on an ongoing basis, so that you can build retention and loyalty among those shoppers is going to be important.
And that actually is kind of a great way or a great place to kind of wrap it up, because what you're talking about is like some of the traditional things aren't going to go away. But you keep expanding your view, and you keep expanding the tools to help you capture that view and then know how to act, which is invaluable. So I want to just kind of close by recapping a couple of the other things that I heard today. And that is, we can expect 2021 to be a really challenging year as we lap that unprecedented sales growth of 2020. But retailers are willing to take the leap to hang on to the success from 2020. And so they're looking beyond the traditional brick and mortar. They're looking at different measurements and different tools and different ways, again, that broader view of how their consumers are living their lives day to day, and maybe looking across other industries to see how they're capturing some of that valuable information and building their relationship with the shoppers. It's important to view the landscape against the rest of the market. But even then, I think that there's, be aware of those blind spots where high growth areas may show up as underperforming versus the rest of the market. And John, you recommended looking at trending data over a period of time, because that smooths out the bumps caused by those more volatile weekly periods, which could include like those special occasions or, like a sporting event or a holiday. You also called out measurement in both terms of both size versus the market and performance versus the market. And I really like that notion of performance, because it identifies the opportunities for growth as well as the barriers for growth. And finally, you touched, of course, on the vast importance of an omnichannel view, and move out of the traditional brick and mortar and look at the entire marketplace. So with that, I want to thank both of you. I think that this is going to be an invaluable look for so many CPGs and retailers to find out really what are you trying to get at the end of the day. So thanks both.
Thank you very much, John. Been fun.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you for listening. Please become a subscriber and let us know what you want to learn more about. We'll serve it up in a future IRI Growth Insights episode. Look for us wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to review IRI Growth Insights. Also, visit us on the web at iriworldwide.com and connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.